link into the chat box, so you can go to the interactive report page there and also download a copy. Please also note this Sunday we have the World Children's Day, and the theme for this year is inclusion for every child. So it's a highly topical event, and very much looking forward to hearing from everyone today. My name is Petra Heusser, and I'm the coordinator of the Geneva Global Hub for Education in Emergencies, who's also co-sponsoring this event today, and I'm very glad to moderate this session and to lead you through the afternoon. A few words about the Geneva Global Hub for Education in Emergencies. The members are currently at 40. They have seen that education in emergencies is so much under-prioritized and underfunded that with the magnitude of the challenge, they really have come together to step up visibility, political and operational commitment, and funding for education in emergencies. Soon, next January, we will celebrate our second year of existence. And one of our goals is working with our members, such as IDMC, to really generate new knowledge, boost the impact of EIE through improved data, research, and evidence. So this is very much at the core of what we are doing together with our members. And of course, I'm very glad to welcome everyone here who made it to join in person. The event is also co-sponsored by IDAC, the International Data Alliance for Children on the Move, and we will hear about them and their programs and their work a little bit later in this call. So the conversation couldn't be more timely. We've seen the Transforming Education Summit of the UN Secretary General in New York in September, and we've seen a strong commitment to action on education in crisis situations coming out of it. It was put forward and launched at the Transforming Education Summit, and it's the highest political agreement on education in emergencies and protracted crisis. It was signed off by over 30 states, and one of its first points refers to the criticality of better tracking the number of crisis-affected children and youth, so that it's really critical to have this data disaggregated by gender, age, and diversity. And today we will hear protection, gaps, and opportunities. Also, as we all know, climate change, food insecurity, the world is grappling with this crisis, and they directly impact communities, displacement, and also education, of course. Now, before diving into the conversation, I'd like to make a last point about the high-level financing conference of ECW, Education Cannot Wait, coming up this February. It is co-hosted, of course, by ECW and the government of Switzerland, and co-convened by Colombia, Germany, Niger, Norway, and South Sudan. And this high-level financing conference, which will take place here in Geneva, will be the next big opportunities for leaders to turn commitments into action by making substantive funding commitments so that no children are left behind, and of course, also internally displaced children. The program for this afternoon will look as follows. So we have Louisa Yasukawa from IDMC, who will speak to us about the key findings of this report. Then we are joined by three brilliant speakers online, panelists, with whom I will have a conversation about their work and why the findings of this report are so important. We will then have time for questions and answers. And finally, we'll have some closing remarks from Emily Woolf of the FCDO. And you're really encouraged and free to type any questions and comments at any moment into the chat box, and we will try to address them after the panel discussion. Now, Louisa, over to you. You're a researcher at IDMC and one of the lead authors of the report. And of course, we very much look forward to hear about the key findings that you found in your research.
Thank you very much, Petra. Perfect. Thanks, Chiara. Great, and I'd like to start by saying a big thank you to everyone who's here in the room today and who's joined online. And a special thanks, as Petra mentioned, to the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office for supporting this study, and to the Global Geneva Hub and IDAC for co-sponsoring this event. I'd also like to thank all our partners who kindly peer-reviewed the report, some of whom are online today, and the team of students from the Graduate Institute who provided key inputs, and also to all my IDMC colleagues for bringing it together. So before I dive into the key findings of the report, I thought I'd start by posing this question. Why should we care about IDPs' access to education? The fact that you're at this event seems to suggest that you already know the answer to this question, but in order to avoid any doubt, I thought I'd give you some reasons why. So firstly, internal displacement due to conflict, violence, and disasters has reached an all-time high. 59.1 million people were recorded to be internally displaced at the end of 2021, and an estimated 30% of all IDPs are aged between 5 and 17. And to put that in perspective, this represents roughly the whole population of the Netherlands. So we're not talking about an insignificant group here. Secondly, internal displacement has immediate and longer-term repercussions on children's education. And this year we've seen devastating reports of children displaced by conflict in Ukraine and flooding in Pakistan, and how they've been separated not only from their homes, but also from their schools. Thirdly, although many children in conflict and crisis-affected communities require education support, evidence suggests that internally displaced children are often disproportionately affected and face heightened barriers to learning. IDP separation from livelihoods, networks, loss of documentation, their geographical and social marginalization affect children's education in ways. And we've seen various assessments that have demonstrated that enrollment rates are often lower for internally displaced children than their non-displaced counterparts. And finally, we should care about IDPs' access to education because internally displaced children remain largely invisible. IDPs receive less attention in the media and research than refugees and migrants, are afforded special protection under international law. IDPs are the responsibility of their national governments, which often compounds their invisibility. Target 4.5 of Sustainable Development Goal 4 specifies the need to ensure access to education in vulnerable situations, which is widely recognized to include IDPs. There is also growing consensus that disaggregating education indicators by displacement status is essential to fill the SDG's commitment to leave no one behind. So if that's why it's important to understand this topic, what do we know? Or rather, what don't we know? And I'm sorry to say that there is a lot on this topic that we don't know. So firstly, we don't know how many school-age IDPs are internally displaced precisely. We also don't know where they are located or what their characteristics are, including their sex, disability status, or ethnicity. We don't have quality, timely, or comparable figures on their access to education, including their attendance and completion rates. We don't know how many IDPs are out of school or what the quality of education they are receiving. And thirdly, we don't know much about the cost of IDPs' education, including what's currently being spent on their education and what is needed to provide them with quality education. The significant gaps in data at the national level mean internationally comparable figures on IDPs' education are largely unavailable. UNESCO's Institute for Statistics, for instance, which is the official source of internationally comparable data on education, does not currently include indicators that are disaggregated by displacement status, though we will hear from Artur later on about efforts that are underway to address this. So if these are the gaps in knowledge, then why is it important that we gain this information? Well, there are several reasons, and these include, firstly, understanding the scale of the issue. Secondly, planning and costing effective responses. Thirdly, measuring progress. And finally, evaluating the impact of interventions. So in light of these gaps, we are pleased today to launch our report on informing better access to education for IDPs. It highlights the data landscape on IDPs and provides top-line estimates of the number of internally displaced school-age boys and girls in 13 countries. It explores different data sources and methodologies to measure their access to quality education and education costs, and highlights promising practices and tools for addressing data gaps. So as I said, the report focuses on 13 countries, and you can see them listed here. And within this list of 13, we include 9 of the 10 countries with the highest number of IDPs worldwide due to conflict and violence at the end of 2021. And you can see here they're indicated with the orange arrow. So now on to the findings. So part one of the report focuses on data on IDPs. And we start by asking, why are internally displaced children so invisible? And the first reason is due to the lack of data on IDPs in general. And what little data exists on IDPs is rarely disaggregated by displacement status, which means that internally displaced children are particularly unaccounted for. Secondly, national governments are primarily responsible for the provision of education to IDPs and related data collection, but most lack the capacity or will to monitor the issue systematically. And there are various reasons for this that affect data collection. So for instance, conceptual and methodological challenges can make it different for data collectors to agree on who should be defined as an IDP. And in cases where IDP movements are highly fluid, it's often very difficult to capture internally displaced children in annual school censuses and other administrative data. There are also political factors. For instance, some governments don't recognize IDPs in their countries, and in other cases, IDPs may not want to be identified in data collection for fear of discrimination or violence. In addition, there are capacity and resource constraints, as well as a lack of coordination and data sharing, particularly within national government collectors. Humanitarian development, civil society, and research organizations also collect important data on IDPs' education, but they tend to use different methodologies and definitions, which makes it difficult to standardize and compare figures. So in absence of precise information, IDMC has developed a methodology to estimate the number of internally displaced school-aged children in the 13 countries. And for the purposes of these calculations, we use the ages 5 to 11 for pre-primary and primary school children and 12 to 17 for secondary children, though we recognize that these school groups change depending on the country. So we start by taking the percentage of the national population aged in these two groups, and you can find this information via the UN Population Prospects website. We then apply this percentage to our total number of IDPs living in each of the countries at the end, and we use that figure to estimate the number of school-aged IDPs. So on to the key findings. So across the 13 countries, we estimated that there were 14 million school-aged IDPs, and this includes 7.1 million boys and 6.9 million girls. And here you have a list of the countries by ranking. And if you go to the interactive webpage on our website where the report is launched, you can actually download all these data sets. And you can also disaggregate the data by the number of school-aged children displaced by conflict and violence and by disasters. So there are, of course, limitations to this methodology. And the first one to note is that IDMC's estimates of the total number of IDPs in each country are likely to be conservative due to the availability of data. And this is especially the case when it comes to our disaster displacement figures. And secondly, evidence shows that the proportion of children amongst displaced populations is often higher than among the national population. So we actually conducted 4 case studies in Colombia, Ethiopia, Nigeria, and Somalia. And you can see that in Colombia and Ethiopia, the percentage of IDPs we surveyed who are below the age of 18 was higher than the national population in those countries. In the case of Nigeria and Somalia, however, the percentage was much closer. So now on to part 2 of the report, which looks at access to quality education. So in this section of the report, we look at primary data collected by IDMC and other partners that explore the ways in which internal displacement creates disruptions to schooling. So for instance, in our study in Plateau State of Nigeria, we found that 54% of IDPs were out of school for 4 to 12 months, and 19% were out of school for 1 to 2 years after being displaced by violence. We also discussed the various barriers to quality education, some of which we have listed here. And to illustrate this, we have a quote here from one of the teachers we interviewed in Colombia. They explained, "We talk about the right to education, but it's not guaranteed. It's not enough that the child is registered in school. They must also have the means to get to school, buy their uniform, their notebooks and food, so that they don't have to think about their empty stomachs while they're in class." In addition, we also discussed the differentiated impacts of displacement and particularly the disparities between genders. So we have a dedicated spotlight to gender disparities in access to education in Somalia and Ethiopia. And I know Farishta will be able to discuss this further in her interventions as well. We also discussed the impacts on children with disabilities and Indigenous groups and the need for more data to be able to understand these intersecting vulnerabilities. We then discussed some of the methodologies used to estimate IDPs' access to education. And as I said, those internationally comparable figures are not available. However, based on the data that is available, several organizations have come up with ways to estimate this. So one of that's particularly worth noting is the efforts of Education Cannot Wait. And they recently estimated that there are 11.1 million internally displaced children in emergency settings out of school, of whom 54% are girls. IDMC also came up with a methodology to estimate access to education for the 13 countries we studied. So we estimated that about 9 million IDPs in these countries could be at risk of missing out on education because they did not receive support through humanitarian response plans in 2021. And I invite you to see the report for a further discussion of the methodology and the limitations of these estimates. So part 3 of the report looks at education costs. And as I said at the beginning, data on the costing of IDPs is scarce. So here you can see that there have been existing methodologies to estimate the cost of providing refugee children with education and crisis-affected children with education, but few have focused specifically on internally displaced children. And so in light of that gap, we've also developed a methodology to try to estimate the cost of providing IDPs with education support via humanitarian response plans. And we look at the annual humanitarian response plans for each of the 13 countries. And based on the data in those plans, we estimate the cost of education per IDP. We then apply that to the total number of IDPs in each country between the ages of 5 and 17 to work out the overall expense. Now, this represents the amount that humanitarian responders would have required to provide education support to all displaced children for a year. It does not respond to the amount that they actually received or the amount that they requested. So based on that methodology, we estimated that the average cost across the 13 countries falls between $81 and $93 per child. The total cost of providing support for all IDPs is between $1.1 billion and $1.3 billion a year just for the 13 countries. Now, again, there are important limitations of this methodology. The first being that the funds requested in HRPs may not amount to the actual cost of delivery. They also include a number of indirect costs, and they're based on several planning assumptions and projections. So they may not to the actual cost of providing education support in practice. The estimates also do not reflect how the cost of education support varies depending on a child's grade, although we do give a range. And finally, the education support provided by response plan is seen as a temporary measure, and the support provided is through parallel means outside the formal education system. So for this reason, one of the key messages of our report is that investments should really focus on integrating IDPs in national education systems as quickly as possible, as not only the most sustainable solution, but also a way to guarantee better quality of education and to promote their greater integration amongst the non-displaced community. And finally, part 4 of the report looks at ways forward to improve data. And I know we're going to hear from Aina and Artur about concrete ways that various organizations are already doing this and working with national partners to do so. So I won't go into further detail, but I will just conclude by highlighting a few action points and takeaways that we make in our report. So in order to strengthen evidence-based policymaking on IDPs education, we recommend firstly improving the availability of data on IDPs in general. by establishing formal registries of IDPs, identifying IDPs when conducting surveys, and collecting better time series data after disasters. We also recommend ensuring data on IDPs is disaggregated by age, sex, disability status, and other characteristics where possible to better identify and understand their intersecting needs. We also encourage adapting national education systems to identify IDPs where it is possible to do so safely, and investing in systematically monitoring their access to education, the quality of education they receive, and associated costs. And finally, we encourage strengthening coordination amongst government, humanitarian, and development data collectors by standardizing the definitions and indicators they use and ensuring data is collected ethically and shared and updated regularly. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the panel discussion, which will dive deeper into many of these issues.
Thank you so much, Louisa. I think for a very clear presentation of the findings, a lot of food for thought that we will now have the time to unpack with our panelists, and then subsequently also by a conversation with all of you. Very much looking forward to this. So in terms of format, we do have 3 speakers who are online, and I will ask them each 2 questions that they'll respond to. I believe they're online, we just lost the connection. All right. So I'm very honored to introduce our first panelist, Farishta Afzaly, a youth advocate for gender equality and quality education in Afghanistan, dedicated to support girls' access to higher education. I can see you. Farishta, are you able to see us? We have a little bit of an issue with the screen here in the room. You can, okay, you can see us very well. So I hope we can also hear a response. The question is, what does having access to quality education mean to you? And why is it essential that internally displaced children and other displaced populations do have access to quality education?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. I'm very grateful for this platform and opportunity. Quality education for me means having access to resources at school, having qualified teachers, and having a safe environment where everyone is regardless of their gender, ethnicity, and how they look. For me, quality education is when teachers teach the students critical thinking and encourage them to ask questions and be curious. As a result of quality education, women in countries like Afghanistan fight the inequalities and stand for themselves and fight for their rights. Unfortunately, there are 3 main problems why children in Afghanistan are forced to leave education permanently, such as poverty, inequality, and lack of facilities and infrastructure. However, now with the Taliban taking control of the country, the situation is incredibly challenging. More than 2 million girls are out of school, and it is more than a year since the Taliban have banned education for secondary school girls. On 17 September 2021, the Taliban banned girls from secondary education, and the door to schools still remains closed. According to Internal Displacement Monitoring Center's report, there are more than 1.9 million internally displaced persons between the age of 5 to 7 by end of 2021 in Afghanistan. And Save the Children states that displaced children are more likely to be forced into marriage, child labor, or recruited by armed groups. In 2022 May, the Taliban issued a decree that all women have to cover their full body and wear burqa and only come out of home if needed. Women are not permitted to take subjects like journalism, agriculture, engineering, or economics. Now the Taliban have banned women from going to amusement park, sport clubs, restaurants, just to name a few. And they are deprived of their right to work, education, and freedom of movement. Besides, the female protesters are also being lashed and they are beaten. According to UN Women and UNHCR, fact sheet, lack of education will have long life consequences. Whereas a study shows that women with higher education are not forced into marriage, they are paid better at job, they have more decision making power, they own more assets and are less exposed to violence by intimate partners. And also, activists say that the number of female students applying for university will fall dramatically in the coming years unless the Taliban reopens secondary education to girls from grade 6 to 12. For example, in Laghman province last year, nearly 1,200 girls took the test, while this year the number had fallen to just 182 girls. When the Concord examination, which is the national examination, result was announced on 5 November, the top scorers were all male, whereas in the past 2 years before the Taliban, the top scorers were girls. It is obvious that the girls who are barred from secondary education for a year now have no motivation to prepare for an examination, and they are deprived of quality education. They even do not know how long the schools will remain closed and whether they will have a chance to continue learning. As one of the girls who were internally displaced from Mazar to Kabul told me that I was having my midterm exams when the Taliban took control of Mazar. I could not finish my exams and we were displaced. With so much challenges, we went to Kabul and we stayed there for 2 months. When I returned, the teacher, without informing me about the exams, took 6 exams from me within the same day. And as I had to catch up with the classes and I had no preparation. Therefore, I did have a bad score. Uh, this also impacted my eligibility to take the national examination. I could not prepare myself for the test. In the school where I was studying for almost 11 years, I left that school so that I could prepare myself for the Concord or national examination. I missed both the opportunities. Now I am at home doing nothing. This is just one of the examples of the internally displaced persons, let alone those who are in the camps or who have been permanently displaced in the country. If there is high quality teaching, student learning will be increased too. We cannot ignore the fact that the internal displacement impacts quality, learning, and outcomes of education. Lack of attention towards the children's development, lack of skilled teachers, and lack of early learning opportunities deprives generation from growth. Internally displaced children's education should not be considered as an internal issue, and shouldn't be considered as something that has to be solved by the state. We need to make sure they have access to quality education. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Farishta. So you have very much confirmed, of course, for Afghanistan, what we heard from the report, right? That internally displaced children, oftentimes girls, they have much more difficulty to access schools or go back quickly to schools. So just maybe very briefly, could you tell us what could be done to reduce these barriers for girls? How can we achieve more girls going back to displacement more quickly and staying in education?
Absolutely. I would say, first of all, that nowadays, especially similar to women in Iran, Afghan women are like fighting for the same slogan, which is women, life, and freedom. We want to have our life, we want to have our say, our agency over our lives. Afghan girls and women are not in situation to even raise their voices to the international community, as they will be either tortured or abducted by the Taliban. So first of all, international community should not recognize the Taliban because their recognition means death to the Afghan girls. In a country where women have no right to go to park, to sports club or restaurants, because the Taliban want to erase women, but the world should not let that happen. All we are asking is from the international community to help us to stand for our rights and have the right to get education. It's not too much that we are asking from the international community. Apart from that, schools should be reopened and everybody has the right to learn. With the situation of Afghanistan getting worse day by day, it's the international community's responsibility to monitor the situation and prevent a generation from being deprived of their basic rights. And particularly with the internally displaced girls, to reduce gender disparity, it's very important to understand that we need to involve both men and women in this effort to reduce barriers for displaced girls. Unless men realize the power of education for their daughters and female members of the family, they will not take any concrete measures. So they should be part of the solution. Of course, with the quality education, it brings two fundamental work, which breaks the poverty cycle. It also increases gender equality efforts. Many children, particularly girls, they do not have access to devices, technological devices that prevents them from getting education. And in Afghanistan, there are like ethnic minorities who are in grave risk of being attacked, let's say Hazaras. So they have to be provided with safety and educational institutions. Knowledge is the skill in order to increase sustainable development, human rights, gender equality, peace, and cultural diversity. Therefore, it's really crucial for the international community to work together with the organizations in Afghanistan who are having their interventions and efforts to provide access to education to internally displaced children, so that we make sure they also have a right to uh, access the education or the needs to education. And especially with the dire situation in Afghanistan, we need to also understand what are the challenges for these internally displaced children. I think at least in these kind of situation, we have to understand that these girls who are internally displaced, or the girls in Afghanistan in general, all they are asking is having the right to go to school. There are lack of women teachers. We should also understand the context in Afghanistan. If we have more skilled female teachers, it means we are opening more doors for females to come to school. So I think this is very important to have a bottom-up approach, understanding the context and trying to approach the leaders in the community so that they can encourage parents. And we have to include both men and women in this effort so that we make sure we provide education to internally displaced children, and especially to the girls who are out of school.
Farishta, thank you so much for your thoughts and for the action for both the international community, but also the population, of course, which is directly affected. We are now going to our next panelist. We have heard that internally displaced children are oftentimes very invisible, right? We don't know how many girls, how many boys have been displaced that are in school age. So then it makes it very difficult to do the programming adequately and also the policies. I invite now our second speaker, Artur Borkowski, who's an associate program specialist on EIE data to UNESCO. And I'd like to hear a little bit more about these data gaps. Artur, so we know that national governments, right, they are the ones responsible, of course, to collect this data, and they're responsible to get internally displaced children in school and that they have a quality, safe education. However, in the report you've shown, IDMC has shown, that countries are not systematically collecting data on internally displaced children's education. So how could their information systems be adapted to include this situation? What's your experience on this?
Great question, Petra, and thanks for having me here. I mean, I think this is obviously a very complex question, as we heard from Farishta. If the political will nationally isn't there, this is going to be something that's very difficult to do. And I think this is where international political will can step up and perhaps fill some of the gaps. But in the case where there is political will, I think there are some things we can do. And I think maybe first starting from a sort of policy inclusion perspective, making sure that IDPs are explicitly included in policies around education, right? So I mean, we have education sector plans in a number of countries, those that perhaps include IDPs as part of those, and then the monitoring frameworks for those education sector plans are going to be more likely to monitor IDP education, right? So I think that's really the starting point. Without that, we can't really start talking about why aren't you collecting this data if you don't really have a policy process set out around we need to include IDPs in this, then it's just not going to happen. So I think that would be step one. The other thing is, of course, we can't expect full inclusion from the outset. We can't expect countries to go from not having any data on IDP education to having all the data on IDP education. And we have to understand, I think, as an international community as well, what the steps going from you don't have any data to what is the full set of data you should be having. What are the steps along the way, and how can the international community support those steps, right? I think this is something we have a relatively poor understanding of, both for IDPs and refugees. And while there's a growing body of literature on what works to get refugees or IDPs into education, we don't really have that for how do we improve the data systems on IDP education, right? And I think that sounds very doom and gloom, but really what I'm trying to say here is we're actually not starting from scratch, right? There are existing data collection exercises, right? We have the annual school census, we have household surveys, we have census, and so on. There is ways to capitalize on these and build on existing global standards like the Expert Working Group on Refugee and IDP Statistics. There are standards for IDP statistics or refugee statistics. The Joint IDP Profiling Center has also done a bit of work on how to make these more concrete. So there are concrete questions that can be included in existing data collection exercises, specifically census and household surveys, that can make existing data collection exercises more useful in that regard for IDP education. That said, there's different challenges when we come to annual school censuses and making sure that IDPs are actually included in normal school settings rather than non-formal settings, and how we count IDPs there. So I think there's still a lot of challenges. And I mean, for maybe one that is particularly pertinent now, given the sort of learning crisis dialogue, is we don't really know anything about the learning of IDPs. But actually, we also don't know how to capture them in learning assessments very well. How do you sample IDPs, especially if they're not in a camp setting? How do you actually ask IDP children, are you an IDP? How do you identify IDP children in a learning assessment? You have to ask their parents, their teachers, especially in cases where we don't have an education monitoring information system that manages or tracks individual students, right? But how do we do that? I don't think we have good answers to that yet, really. We're working towards them, but I don't think we have them yet. So I think there's a part here where there are good practices, and I think this is sort of maybe point 4 or 3, I don't remember which one I'm on, is there needs to be some sort of peer learning. And I think that's something that we're starting to see. So the International Alliance for Data for Data Against Children on the Move is something that's starting, and you have that peer learning process. And I think we'll hear from Aina a little bit later about what they're doing on that. I think there's also regional coordination mechanisms, for example, in Latin America, where UNESCO is working to bring together 25 ministries of education to have a peer learning process on people on the move more generally, and how data for their education can be collected across contexts. And there's countries that are doing, let's say, better, and countries that are not collecting this data. And they can learn from each other on what the challenges are and how to move forward, right? And I think that's a key thing, really, because it's one thing for the international community to say, this is how you should do it. It's another thing to learn from peers who are going through the same process, right? Or undergoing the same challenges. And then finally, I think funding. I mean, they were talking about governments that are in crisis context or in a context of conflict. These are not high capacity governments necessarily, right? And so there needs to be funding from the international community, right? So there's a concrete gap, is that funding gap, I think. And that's something hopefully with ECW's funding conference coming up, in a few months, that's something that we can work towards filling. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, you mentioned a lot of the challenges, right, that are still laying ahead, but you also referred to a few positive examples and good practices about data that is available on the internally displaced children and that should be going to school. So could you tell us more about UNESCO's work, how you work about standardization and sharing of data, because often what's available is not available very widely. So what is UNESCO doing in this area of work?
Yeah, great question. So I think there's a number of things that we're doing. I think the most relevant and pertinent here is we have an IDP, so internally displaced persons education expert working group, where we've brought together the 5 big data producers on this. So the Joint IDP Profiling Center, IDMC, the International Organization for Migration, Global Education Cluster, and the REACH Initiative to sit down around the table and say, okay, this is the data that we're collecting across 6 countries. This is how we ask questions around, for example, attendance, and showing that, okay, there is differences here in how we ask a question on attendance, right? And that's problematic. It means we can't compare questions on attendance. But how do we go from that? And this is what we're working through now, is going from that to say, okay, this is the sort of bare minimum question you would ask on attendance that would allow us to compare across contexts, right? And that's one thing. The other is actually looking and talking to the people implementing this in the organizations and seeing what the challenges to implementing standard data collection are. I think that's, again, something that we struggle to understand as a community, is what are the concrete challenges for organizations collecting data to implement standardized data collection? It's not like we don't want to collect standardized data. And we know that this sort of education in emergencies, there's a lot of contextualized data that needs to be collected. But what the concrete challenges to collecting those are, I think, is a little bit less clear. And so we're trying to understand that. The other thing is this aforementioned regional monitoring framework in Latin America, led by UNESCO colleagues there. We're really bringing together these 25 ministries of education and going through the process of developing a set of indicators that they would collect across these contexts. Right now, there's about 13 indicators that are being proposed, and this is being discussed by the Ministries of Education actually next week for approval. So there's an ongoing process there that's part of the larger Quito process in the region to make sure that these populations are included. And again, this includes a broader set rather than IDPs, but I think it's part of the same process, really. I can go further. I mean, in terms of sort of concretely understanding what's happening, we conducted sort of similar exercise country by country across the top 30 refugee hosting countries, for instance, to understand what data exactly is being collected and how it's being collected. So what are the questions on profiling IDPs that are being asked in these data collection exercises? Are they, for instance, self-identifying as refugees or IDPs? Is there a set of characterization questions as suggested by the expert working group? Or is there some sort of proxy that can be used, say, for example, nationality? So really going from that and showing that this is the case. Again, I think in our experience, showing people how fragmented things have been is actually the first step. Because there is this dialogue again in the community that the data is extremely fragmented. And that's true, but I think it's very difficult to understand how fragmented that is unless you can show step by step what the differences in the questions are, for example. So that's really sort of the sort of regional work, and there's more, but I'll stop there on that. And then just say at country level, we also have a team working actually from Geneva with the International Institute for Education Planning in Ethiopia and South Sudan, actually working with the ministries of education to see how we work across the triple nexus, if you will, to bring together different data producers and understand how the data from different producers can feed the ministry's response, right? And feed into ministry systems so they can do planning. And so working in those two contexts to understand that. So I think there's a lot of ongoing work. It's really about how do we bring this all together and improve data systems across the board, right?
Yeah, super exciting work ongoing. I would have lots and lots of more questions, but holding them for now, and also encouraging colleagues on the line. You can write into the chat box any questions for Artur or also Farishta, and we can hopefully address them later on in the conversation. So we heard a lot about the gaps, but we also heard about good approaches to data. And now I'm glad to invite our third speaker, Aina Saetre, who's a statistics and data analysis officer at UNHCR. And today she's here with us and representing IDAC, so the International Data Alliance for Children on the Move. And of course, IDAC has been really a pioneer in improving the availability of actionable data, also including on displaced children's education. So I'd really like to ask you the first question, Aina. So how will better data, the collection and the use of it, how will it actually help us in programming, policies, and resource allocation?
Thank you so much for the introduction, Petra. First of all, congratulations on the launch of the report. It's great to see this important report coming to life, and I'm looking forward to share it with colleagues, of course. As we know, the majority of people that are forced to flee are displaced within their countries. Displacement affects children's education, both related to access and quality. Access to education is an important factor for IDP's possibility to return, integrate, and reduce fragility. I've read your report, and I might mention some of the key points from the report in my intervention here, but that's just to stress the importance of what was said already by Louisa. In countries affected by internal displacement, data on internally displaced children is key for designing better programs and monitoring their effectiveness. Not knowing precisely how many children are displaced, where they are, or the nature of their education needs will have serious negative effects on their current and future lives, as also mentioned by Louisa earlier. The experience of displaced children are diverse. The way displacement affects their schooling varies depending on their age, gender, disability status, and other characteristics. Without
Aina, apologies. Something happened and you were muted. Just one sentence back, maybe, while we unmute you, or you unmute yourself, and we are back on track.
Oh,
apologies, small glitch there.
Let me see. Maybe I should start with, without proper age and sex disaggregated data, we won't be able to know exactly what the educational needs of IDP children are. Preschool age children have different needs from primary, secondary, and tertiary students. Boys and girls also differ in terms of educational interest, learning habits, and protection needs. As mentioned by one of the previous speakers, girls more negatively affected in some countries. This is also shown by the study that was referred to from Afghanistan that UNHCR and UNFPA undertook in collaboration. Data about the socioeconomic situation of IDP children and their families also tell us who are the children most in need or are exposed to greater risks and harms, including sexual exploitation and abuse and threats to mental and physical health in their household or in the broader community. Timely, accurate, and disaggregated data on IDP children will help all actors concerned with the education of these children, their families, governments, civil society, international organization, and the donor community to provide targeted and country-specific interventions. Data on cost of providing quality education to displaced children is essential for resource mobilization, planning, and budgeting, as this report also shows. More timely and reliable data on public education expenditure in countries affected by internal displacement would also help us understand the resources needed to reintegrate IDPs into national systems in the new location, but also if and when returning. In connection with this, we need to know more about the obstacles related to integration of returning IDPs. An IOM study, or International Organization for Migration study, of IDP returnee households in Iraq from 2020 showed that some families experience difficulties in accessing education for their children aged 6 to 70 years old. 11% of households reported that they have at least one child not attending education regularly, at least 4 days a week. The obstacles that force children in these families to involuntarily miss schooling are clustered in 3 main categories. In more than half of the cases reported, the obstacles refer to school facilities being not operational, either due to damage, to being occupied, or to lack of students. This was followed by physical limitations, including barriers linked to disability and lack of safety while accessing schools. As mentioned previously, Sustainable Development Goal Target 17.18 focuses on the need for more systematic data disaggregation. UNHCR is a member of the expert group on refugee, IDP, and statelessness statistics. The group consists of national, regional, and global actors from the statistical system, with a focus on national actors. I think we have about 45 countries as members. IGRIS recommends that data on IDPs be disaggregated by age, sex, date, and place of birth, among other variables. IGRIS and IDEC, through its members, including IOM, UNICEF, GIPS, and IDMC, work closely with national statistical systems to build their capacity in this area. This is built on the thinking that inclusion in statistical system will enhance inclusion in national planning and policy development. UNHCR is further recommending that 12 indicators in the SDG framework is disaggregated by forced displacement status, including indicator 4.1.1, proportion of children and young people in grades 2 and 3 at the end of primary and at the end of lower secondary achievement, at least a minimum of proficiency level in reading and mathematics by sex. This recommendation was developed in consultation with the IGRIS group. Comprehensive, comparable, and disaggregated data on displaced children's education is important to improve planning and overcome barriers to learning. Not only is better quantitative and qualitative data on IDPs' access to school needed, there is also a particular shortage of information on the quality of the education they receive and their achievement. Some of the same challenges are faced in the area of refugee education data, including quality education received. Lessons learned from the refugee area could inform the IDP work, though different as refugees have crossed an international border. What we see in the refugee area is that increased complexity of humanitarian emergencies present several challenges when it comes to data collection. In addition, commendable progress in the incorporation of refugees in national education systems creates additional challenges, such as lack of data on student enrollment disaggregated by protection status, an issue that is likely to persist for the foreseeable future. When refugees are incorporated into national system, it is often difficult to keep track of when and where they are accessing education. In other contexts, where some refugees attend camp schools and other public schools, data reported by country operations is only on camp-based populations and thus not representative of all school-age refugees, of course. With such limitations considered, the data received gives us a picture, albeit incomplete, an incomplete one, of the state of education for refugee learners. The message is clear. We are still a long way away from the full participation of refugees in exercising the right to education. Although we do not have the full picture, there are examples where data is supporting programming and policy development. For example, an intention survey from UNHCR on the Ukraine situation conducted prior to the start of the 2022-2023 school year found that 73% reported that they will send their children aged 5 to 17 years old to formal school within their current host country. while 18% reported a preference for the children to continue with online remote learning in the Ukrainian curriculum. The opportunity to follow the Ukrainian curriculum online and virtually attending lessons is made available by Ukraine's Ministry of Education and Science, an option many families have taken in the hope they will be able to return to their former schools soon or enter Ukrainian universities in the future. Research conducted by UNHCR between July and August 2022 in 26 countries applying the Temporary Protection Directive found the following 5 top barriers to education for refugees in these countries. Lack of space in school, lack of specific documents required to register with local schools, language barriers, lack of permanent address, lack of information. The report recommends that focus is on supporting schools in host states to increase capacity and provision of language courses, as this will enhance effective access to education for refugee children from Ukraine, as well as supporting their parents and caretakers to access the labor market. Engaging with the other recommendations from the report was that it was important to engage with displaced families and communities, as this is an option for education, including through integrating refugee community members into national schools as teaching support assistants, to build trust and promoting effective access to education. Although this is a study on refugees, I would think that these recommendations would also have some relevance for the IDP area. We will not be able to achieve SDG 4 if we do not have data and progress for all different groups affected by forced displacement, including IDPs, refugees, returnees, asylum seekers, and stateless. UNHCR works closely with UNESCO, UNICEF, Ministries of Education, and with support from donors to improve the work. But more importantly, and also a main takeaway from the report, is that schools not only provide a place for learning, they are also safe havens that protect children from risk of abuse and exploitation, provide school meals, health, hygiene, and psychosocial services. Education helps to foster IDPs integration and equity. When designed and delivered effectively, it's a powerful tool for reducing conflict and fragility, and with that also minimizing the risk of displacement. Thank you.
Aina, thank you. Yes, wonderful. Thank you so much. And I think you really pointed to us a lot of the elements that IDAP is working on in partnership also with national governments and many of the barriers that we see across displaced populations. So I'd like now to open up the floor for questions or comments, and we might bring our panelists in again, of course, to address them. So if you're online, you can type your question or raise your hand, and equally in the room, please feel free to raise any questions you might have. Yes, please. Hi, Super. Can you also introduce yourself, because colleagues online, they don't see your name, so.
Thank you very much, Petra, for the invitation today, and I very much appreciate the report's findings. It's very interesting. Actually, I'm the program director for Action for Development. It's a Swiss organization which is based in Switzerland, and we are focusing on education for the vulnerable children, and particularly girls in Afghanistan. So all our programs are in Afghanistan. We work with the street working children in Afghanistan and also girls who are now banned from education. I'm sorry, I couldn't listen to all what Farishta was saying, because I really feel that pain which she was expressing. For a moment, I had to go out of the room. But coming back to the situation today, it's really, and we see all the figures prove that Afghanistan is at the highest rate concerning the IDPs, children and girls in particular, who face a lot of problems for their immediate right to education. I think it's very very imperative that we find meaningful ways how to address this situation. I hope that UN will find a tool that would be sufficiently enough to force the current government to have access to the girls. Because as it was also mentioned by the panelists, there is a huge difference between the countries whose government is pushing for education, but they cannot access and cannot provide it. And there is a completely different, on the other side, the government that does not allow the girls and even a lot of boys. I know that there are problems for boys also to access proper education in Afghanistan. So we should find some type of means to address it. And as the statistics show, there is clearly a lot of problems that could be faced after a couple of years if this will persist in the same way. Coming back to the point, to the question I had, for me, it was, well, and maybe since we are discussing the issue of IDPs, maybe they could precise a little bit on the criteria that they are looking for the, or identifying IDPs, because when we would collect data, how we could identify IDPs and segregate them from other members of the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Zuhra. So we heard about the political will, right? And we also heard that previously in the conversations. And then really, how do we use all this data that we're gathering to really make an impact for the children, for the girls and boys? If there are any other questions, I suggest that we take them together. So how to work specifically with national governments to really identify internally displaced people, children, and then to work towards including them in schools and learning. If there are no immediate questions, I'm wondering if Artur, you wanted to take this one, or Aina, if you wanted to respond to this about working with national governments. Yes, Aina, go ahead.
I can have a go at that. The expert group on refugee and IDP statistics that was mentioned by Artur as well has that as a goal, to work with national partners, national governments, thinking that inclusion of IDPs, refugees, asylum seekers, stateless in national statistical system will also lead to reflecting these groups in national programming and planning, as well as policy development. But it's quite a long way to go, and we have conversations with all the members in the group to see how we can develop together identification questions that can be included in censuses and household surveys that are undertaken. And there is also both political will in many countries and technical skills to do it, but it's still it's a long way to go. And I think working with national statistical system is a longer term capacity building work as well, that is requiring investments and also time. Maybe Artur, if you would like to add to some of the things that is said here, but one of the advantages of working with national governments, of course, is that you have the ownership and also the sustainability, and it will also, as we have managed to include these population in data collection exercises at country level, the chances that they will be included for a longer timeline is also quite big. So a lot of investments to make it happen, but once they are included, I have the strong belief that then they will be staying in these systems and provide that important information for a longer time period, comparable over time, comparable with the host, comparable even between countries. But if we want data faster, quicker, we might also look at other data sources, but I don't see any limitations in that. I see that we can do different things in parallel, work on national inclusion. At the same time, we work on operational data that can also support programming and project implementation.
Thank you, Aina. And I see also Artur is ready to come in as well on the question. And if I may add maybe a little bit to it. Also, we speak about national governments, but what are steps or factors to also work with local governments? Of course, schools are not all at the capital level, they're far out in regions. And what kind of work is ongoing so that this connection is really being made? Over to you, Artur, if that's something you could also address.
I mean, I can try. I think I have less information about that connection between, I think, local governments and national governments. I think there's a lot of good work being done by UNICEF, UNHCR, and colleagues to try to do this and to bridge that gap. But I mean, I think this is really where this point I mentioned on sort of working with national governments on the policy side to make sure that there is a policy framework that can move from national to local, local to national, right? That is consultative, that does allow some framework for which all areas of the country can work on this, right? It's not just about saying, okay, we're going to collect data and that's it. I think we need to work with governments on that policy environment, and I think that's sort of where UNESCO sort of uniquely placed and is trying to support policy implementation on this. But I mean, I think just to echo Aina, is just, EGRIS does a lot of this, right? It has set standard questions for how to identify IDPs and refugees within existing data collection mechanisms. And I think it's a matter of working with governments to implement this, right? But again, without that policy framework in place that would drive accountability, because it says, we will provide education to IDPs. The data it's there, but it doesn't really speak to policy. So I think that's really what needs to happen, is that link between policy and data, and really starting from the policy perspective is really critical from my perspective, because there is existing data, right? Even if it's from humanitarian actors, it doesn't necessarily tend to make its way up to the government. And this is the sort of second component for me, is the coordination. And the work being done in Ethiopia and South Sudan by the team working with ECW is exactly doing that, right? It's about coordinating across actors to make sure that the data that is collected by humanitarian actors, for instance, doesn't just speak to humanitarian operations. It also speaks to what the government is doing, and standardizing the kinds of questions that are asked, right? For example, and the kind of items that need to be collected so that they speak across the board. I think that's really critical. And that coordination thing, it seems really easy. We say, we just need to coordinate. It's really challenging from experience, right? I think everyone who's tried to do this knows that. And that's really what I think those are the sort of two things, working on the policy side and working to support governments on the coordination side, to bring in humanitarian actors and to make sure that we are going from a humanitarian situation to a sort of longer term development approach to this.
Thanks so much, Artur. Looking around the room, we might have time for another question or comment, or also online colleagues.
A question, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Lauren, and I'm currently a researcher with IOM. I'm looking at the use of schools for IDP sites and collective centers globally. One of the preliminary findings of my research, very preliminary, is related to the fact that the occupation of schools by IDPs is not necessarily one of the key disruptors of educational continuity. Of course, it's failed government systems or preparedness. So my question, and again referencing the report, which mentions the sort of inadequate funding of the HRP, my question is in relation to what extent, in addition to responding to emergency, do we have a responsibility as a humanitarian or international community more broadly to also sort of institution build and support governments in their preparedness? I think Arthur mentioned the triple nexus. And so perhaps, the short answer is that as long as there's a disconnect within this nexus, that is difficult, but just curious if there's any thoughts on this.
Thanks so much. Colleagues online, did you hear the question well? And yeah, anyone, would you want to come in on this one, on the use of school by internally displaced people, and of course also children, that then interrupts education? Might be taking the conversation a step further, right? Maybe an element we're not always directly thinking about. Yes, Artur.
Sure. I think one, we don't really know the scale of that, right? I mean, that's one of the problems globally. But I do think that, I mean, the question sort of speaks to taking a sort of disaster risk reduction approach, right, as well. It's not just about responding to the crisis as it happens, but actually preparing for it in case it happens, right? So when you have examples, for instance, in Bangladesh, you have floating schools in order to sort of reduce disruption during the seasonal monsoons. So I think there is like a lot of good examples on disaster risk reduction that are integrated. It hasn't made its way, I think, globally as an approach. And I think it is one way to link the sort of triple nexus, is taking that sort of planning and preparatory aspect and linking it to that response aspect. And again, that's the sort of link between humanitarian response and the development perspective. It's not just about, okay, we respond and then we continue to provide education, but actually we need to continue to prepare for some disruptions. For, you know, if you have seasonal droughts and then seasonal flooding, there is a way to prevent disruption, right? You might not necessarily prevent all displacement, but you can prevent disruption to education with some preparedness. It's not easy. It requires funding, and it requires the funding to have the long-term perspective, which is hard, I think. But there is ways to do that. And again, colleagues within UNESCO do work on the sort of disaster risk reduction, and the Global Alliance for Disaster Risk Reduction and Resilience in the Education Sector, GADRES, does a lot of this work. Sorry, that's a mouthful. And then, you know, the Comprehensive School Safety Framework is a way to start looking at this. And now that it's adopted all hazards approach, it does, you know, also look at conflict. So there is ways to start bridging this, and there is frameworks for which to approach this. I think it's just a matter of mainstreaming these, if you will, right? And taking that perspective to national governments, which again, it's not easy. I mean, we even see that in Europe now, right? I think there's a lot of challenges, even in highly capable countries and rich countries with this. So if we want to adopt this, it's the sort of long-term, slow process, right? And we have to be prepared to support that.
Thanks so much, Artur. Yes, Lisa.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think I've been reviewing the education section of the humanitarian response plans for the last 3 years, and it's been really interesting to see more of a shift from just focusing on temporary learning centres and creating parallel systems of schooling, to seeing that more of the humanitarian response plans are including plans to assist national governments to support internally displaced children to re-enter schools. So we actually detail a couple of examples in the report, but for instance, in Colombia, the humanitarian response plan includes dedicated action and funding to try to support those national efforts. So it's good to see that at least at the planning stage, there seems to be more of an effort to try to harmonize the two approaches.
Yeah, thanks so much, Lisa, for that addition. And with that, we're also already coming to the end of our session today and to the launch of the report. And I'd like to thank again very warmly to our 3 panelists for your time and for sharing all your insights as well. And I have now the pleasure to hand over to Emily Woolf, who's the head of education policy and partnerships at the Girls Education Department at the FCDO, to share some closing remarks with us. Over to you, Emily.
Thank you so much, Petra. Can you hear me okay?
Very well.
Perfect. Okay. I want to say many thanks to our panelists today also, to Petra for her excellent chairing at the Geneva Hub, and to Louisa for her presentation also of this really important report that we've launched today. I'm just going to speak for a few minutes because we've had such a rich discussion. I think we've probably already covered so many different topics. So just to say at first of all, that education in emergencies and protracted crises is a really important strategic priority for the FCDO. We are a champion of the right to 12 years of education for girls, but with a particular focus on the most marginalised girls. And we know that girls and young women who are affected by conflict and crises are highly vulnerable to permanent dropout from school, and are then also much more likely to become victims of sexual violence or to be married early, for example. So this all is interconnected. In 2016, we helped to establish the Education Cannot Wait global platform and fund as a new way of responding to the emergency education and emergency challenge. And we do continue to be an important partner to ECW as the co-chair for XCOM and as a key donor. And alongside this global fund, we also provide support through our network of British High Commissions and embassies around the world. We have our network of education advisors who are there to sort of work with governments on the ground, with local communities, with non-government organisations to try to find solutions to some of these very tricky, challenging issues, many of which have been mentioned today. But the other thing to say is this is a growing challenge. We heard, I think it was Petra, it might have been Louisa, mention record numbers of people displaced this year. And we know the recent global estimate that 222 million children are out of school or at risk of dropping out of school in conflict and crisis countries. Girls blocked from their right to go to school in Afghanistan. And thank you so much to Farishta and to other colleagues today for their powerful testimony and advocacy about the simply perilous situation for Afghan girls and women. It is a shocking situation for all of us to come to terms with, to try to understand how to respond to it. Also this year, many millions of children have been impacted by the Russian war in Ukraine, the widespread flooding in in Pakistan, and the ongoing impact of famine in Eastern Horn of Africa. So the challenges are great. And the global response our response to these growing challenges, we heard earlier about the global partners and governments coming together around a commitment to action on education in emergencies. That was at the Transforming Education Summit. And I think that does give a sense of how important this issue is and how we all need to actually rally behind the issue. And then in February this coming year, we will have our replenishment of Education Cannot Wait. So all of this is about building a momentum really around trying to grow the global response. But the other thing I think to mention is it's also about really having a very effective response and making sure that we're putting all of our resources and our efforts in the right places at the right time. And I think we've commissioned this report in particular to try to shine a spotlight on internally displaced children and youth. So those, who've moved from their homes because of a crisis. This is so important because IDPs tend to get overlooked. There's so little data about their educational needs, and so little of it is well disaggregated so that we can really understand how to respond. I think the report mentions that only 5% of the records that IDMC looked at and collected together in 2021, only 5% had age disaggregated data. And this is a really critical gap from an education perspective. How can we use that data well if we don't have the real kind of really important elements of understanding that individual's need and what we'll need to do. So this report, I think it does go some way because it gives us an estimate. It gives us that global, not a global number, but a first initial number to think about for those high burden 13 countries where we've got so many IDP populations. So 14 million, 6.9 million girls. And it does also, I think, go some way to unpack the gender disparities that we see in those contexts, the challenges that girls and women in particular are facing. I think there were some really excellent case studies on Somalia and Ethiopia. Why is this report helpful from a development partner perspective? Well, we welcome all the recommendations. That's the first thing to say. And from our perspective, we see that there's work to do at global level and at country level. And it's extremely helpful today to hear from Artur from UNESCO about what possible steps there might be. And I think an important message I heard today is that we're not starting from scratch. We can use the census data, we can use the surveys, we can build on them, and that also we need to learn from each other. There is regional work that we can draw on and bring together for peer learning. But I also heard that there were some important choices and adaptations that need to be made around the survey instruments and the census instruments, and the way in which data is collected at those critical moments when IDPs are identified. And I heard in particular the challenges around including IDP children within learning assessment. And ultimately, that is an extremely important part of the challenge, since we want to be sure that children are making progress, to understand their needs, their learning needs initially, but also for them to make progress. So really understanding this problem can help us, we think, improve the quality of the support we provide. I think that's the nub of it. We want to get to a place where we have the data and we have the evidence that will then put us on a better footing for our response. I thought the work around costing was really useful as well. I think there's much more to do around that, but it does give us a sense of the size of the problem, particularly for these 13 countries. And I think ultimately that's going to then need to be a work in progress to think about how can we take this further through national and global data systems. So from my perspective, from FCDO, we're really grateful to IDMC for doing such an excellent job preparing this report, to the panelists today for their insights and understanding of the problem, and for those who've been attending as participants, and for your rich questions that you've provided and asked of the panel. I think it is now up to me, I think, Petra, to close the meeting, and just to say thank you to everybody again, and we'll look forward to seeing some of you at the replenishment in February, and if not, in meetings before then. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you, Emily, and goodbye, colleagues online. Thank you so much.
Thank you.